But Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Marianne Williamson have decided to come forward and primary challenge Joe Biden. If we look back on the Bernie Sanders experience, him running through the Democratic Party 2016 and 2020, do you feel that there is any value for Marianne Williamson and RFK Jr. to run through the Democratic Party?
Well, there's always value. It's a historic tradition on the left to always run. 1 second. Give me a chance. There's, for some reason, I don't know where it came from, but my voice is hoarse. There's always been a tradition on the left to run candidates in presidential elections and also in local elections in order to use the occasion of an election to reach a broad public. You have a much bigger chance of reaching a broad public in an election cycle than you have in a non-election cycle. So there's always a value to that. And I would certainly counsel everybody to participate in that process who's willing to invest the time and resources to it. Now, if the question is whether I think they have a, so to speak, snowball's chance in hell of winning, that's an altogether separate question. In my opinion, no. And this is not to pour cold water on anybody, but in my opinion, no, for a very simple reason. There were two factors that, as it were, enabled Bernie Sanders in 2016 and 2020. Factor number one was his, if you want to call it, his class struggle platform. It was fundamentally about redistributing the wealth and also simultaneously improving the lives of ordinary people. And he eventually came up with a set of planks, Green New Deal, abolish student debt, abolish student tuition, Medicare for all. He came up with several planks which reached a very broad audience, which resonated for probably the majority of the American people, and maybe even a supermajority of the American people. But that was one factor. The other factor is more, so to speak, nebulous, and that was in a American situation where people are so cynical about politics. Bernie had a half-century track record, actually more than a half-century track record, and so he became credible because he was consistent. They used to say about during when Bernie first went out in the campaign trail in 2016, people would roll their eyes and say, "Oh, Bernie, he's been saying the same thing since the 1960s." And in fact, that was his selling point, that he wasn't trimming his sails or tacking in order to get a favorable outcome. He had stood fairly firm in his beliefs, and the American people were now ready for those beliefs. Bernie was an unusual case because it wasn't the candidate who rose to the times. It was actually the reverse. The times rose to Bernie. Bernie stood still for about 60 years, but our economy did not stand still. Beginning in the 1980s, there's what's called a long stagnation in wages, such that nowadays about 80% of the population are doing worse than their parents did. So he had the advantage of that long track record, which resonated for people otherwise cynical about the political process. The same just can't be said of Marianne Williams and Robert Kennedy Jr. I'm not going to pass judgment on their specific platforms, as well as the statements they have made in the last couple of months. Setting that aside for the moment, as I said, that second factor of consistency, which then produced credibility, or credibility born of consistency. If he didn't have that, I don't think he had a chance. So the fact that Marianne Williamson and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. don't have that consistency that and thence credibility, I don't see any possibility whatsoever. But that being said, as I initially pointed out, it's always been a staple of the left to use the election cycle to send your message.
I want to pivot back to this idea of the value of running through the Democratic Party, because I totally get where you're coming from, but what I have seen on my end, for those of us who were volunteers, those of us who canvassed and phone bank, for these progressive candidates, what I have seen happen is that there's all this energy poured into a campaign, and it seems to take away from organizing any type of movement or mutual aid efforts that can be done on the outside. That's part of the problem that I have, is that there will be that shift where instead of people focusing on what they can do with these outside movements, they tend to focus on a campaign and believe that if this person wins, this is going to be your hero and your savior. That's one problem. The second problem that I have is the actual system that's in place. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the DNC fraud lawsuit. Now, this is coming from DNC attorney Bruce Spiva. So he said there's no such thing as a Democrat. The DNC just encourages people to vote for the Democratic Party. No one has any right to any expectation of a fair election. If the DNC wishes to select a candidate in the primaries instead of a free election process, that is their right. Donating money to Bernie Sanders doesn't mean you thought that money was going to assist him to win the primary. You have no right to think the DNC was obligated to follow their own charter and internal policies about elections. So what's important about this is this piece right here as well. Discussion of and any disputes with the DNC do not belong in a transparent process in a court of law. The DNC is a private organization, which should never be asked to engage in the discovery process or have to reveal any of its internal workings or strategies should they decide to select a candidate rather than allow a fair election of a candidate. It's the system that's the problem. We watched Bernie Sanders. He was cheated in 2016. He won every county in West Virginia, and the superdelegates decided to give that state to Hillary Clinton anyway. So these are the challenges that you come up against if you're running through the Democratic Party. The Republican Party is also corporate as well, but I think it really gets a lot of people's hopes up, like we did with Bernie Sanders. We were really excited, energized. Thousands of people, we could have really had a strong mass outside movement, and that could have continued after Bernie lost, more so the first time, but also the second time. We should have continued that, and we could have taken that energy and built a strong third party movement. So that's the problem that I have with the value in running through the Democratic Party, because it's already rigged against you.
First of all, I think the point you make is an important one, and I wouldn't be at all dismissive of it. As I see it, let me just begin as I did earlier with what I call the socialist tradition, or the left tradition. Forget even socialist tradition, the left tradition. I was recently rereading the works of Rosa Luxemburg, which are currently being translated into the English language, the collected works. And one of the things that struck me in reading her, for those of you listeners who don't know her, and I can understand why, it's a century ago, Rosa Luxemburg was one of the leading figures of the revolutionary Marxist tradition, back at the turn of the 20th century. She was an enormously impressive figure, probably since Karl Marx, the most impressive figure that the socialist movement ever produced. Marx's first biographer, his name was Franz Mehring, Mehring. He once commented about Rosa Luxemburg. He said that she's the most impressive figure for the socialist movement has produced since Karl Marx. And then he went on to say, if that's not recognized, it's because her colossal mind, her head, stands on the shoulders of a woman. That had she not been a woman, the impressiveness of her would have become transparent. She was, by any reckoning, a stupendous historical figure. In any event, when Rosa is talking about what are the tasks, what are the responsibilities, what are the obligations of being a socialist, she says the tasks are twofold: educate and organize. Educate and organize. And the two always go together. Now, that brings me to your question. You say that it becomes a waste of time because you might be carrying on the educating function, but once because I said you can transmit your ideas, you can broadcast your ideas in the election, but what you said, which in my opinion is entirely correct, once you lose, and you're going to lose, if you don't organize, all the energy is going to dissipate. If you don't use the opportunity of educating to at the same time use the opportunity to organize, which means forming a party or forming some institution, then you're entirely correct. Now, what happened with the Bernie campaign? See, the Bernie campaign was very deceptive. I'm not blaming him for it. I'm saying it wasn't clearly, I think, understood. Bernie was running a primary campaign. That is, he wants the Democratic nomination. But he also said simultaneously he was building a revolution. That is, he called it our revolution. What happened with the Bernie campaign was he did organize, eventually became a very successful grassroots campaign. However, the revolution part was lost. There was no enduring organization. Remember what Rosa says, educate. Bernie was, we have to admit it. I don't like all the naysayers saying, oh, he was a fraud from the first place and it was a waste of time and I told you so. I don't go for that. There can be no question in my mind whatsoever that he used that national platform to educate people to a degree which is unparalleled in American history since the Eugene Debs campaign. He was the one that put Medicare for all on the national agenda. He was the one that put big pharma on the national agenda. He was the one who called out Goldman Sachs and all sorts of other people as crooks, a bunch of crooks. Now, I've been around a long time, and I can assure you, even 10 years ago, that would have been, let's call it now, it's still 10 years ago, that would have been unthinkable on national television or any national media. Bunch of crooks calling out the most powerful institutions of our country as being a gang of crooks. That was unthinkable. That was education. The problem, and I will never, ever be dismissive of what a breakthrough that was in the United States. And he put things on the agenda like abolishing student debt. Those were spectacular gains in education. The problem was the organization. It didn't translate into an organization. And then what happened was exactly what Bernie predicted. See, that's the kind of irony of what happened with Bernie Sanders. Throughout the primary, Bernie was constantly confronted with one question, which was a perfectly obvious question. The question was, Bernie, how do you think you could possibly get your platform through Congress? And that was, of course, true. This is, forget about the Republicans. You're not going to get that platform through Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer. Forget it. It's dead on arrival. And Bernie gave the most cogent and convincing answer possible. He said, of course I can't get it through that platform if I stick by the rules of how things are run. He says we have to bring masses of people in the streets. If we bring people into the streets, we have a chance. It's called the Civil Rights Movement, and it's called the New Deal, which were massive mobilizations from below that forced an agenda which otherwise would never have happened. My good friend, the American Marxist economist, Paul Sweezy, he was the greatest living Marxist economist of my generation. And he says people forget that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he said he was quite conservative the first 2 years in office. It was only when the CIO began to organize and there was mass workers' mobilizations from below that the New Deal as a radical idea started to catch hold. So Bernie was, of course, right. But what happened? What happened was when Bernie got into office, he had two options. One was to try to foment that mass movement to push through a radical platform. The other one was to whisper in Biden's ear. He thought, if I stayed close to Biden, Biden respects me, we're family friends, which they were, that I could play the role of articulating the left point of view, and we can get some things. Well, and there was no middle ground, because you can easily imagine, Sabrina, what would happen if Bernie Sanders had called millions of people into the streets, tell them to erect, Occupy Wall Street, erect campsites, get arrested, stop traffic, the whole 9 yards. I think we're gone lost. Yeah, the whole 9 yards. Could you imagine Biden's reaction? Could you imagine?
I could, but he had no intention of doing that, though. And I know that because when I interviewed Jesse Ventura said he approached Bernie Sanders at the beginning of his 2016 campaign. And he said, Bernie, if you lose to Hillary Clinton, will you partner with me and start a third party movement? And Jesse Ventura said Bernie Sanders told him, no, I will be supporting Hillary Clinton.
Yes, I understand that. There is a second issue there, which is Bernie, as you recall, in 2016, he was blamed originally for Hillary's loss. Then they dropped that idea and they started to go after the Russians. But initially, it was supposedly Bernie's fault, although Bernie said from the moment of Hillary won, I went out and campaigned for her nonstop. He was still blamed. When it came to 2020, Bernie did not want to be blamed and have to carry the albatross his whole life of having gotten Trump elected again. So the moment he dropped out, he decided, I'm going whole hog for Biden. Yes, he did believe, as did many people, and many people do believe, that Trump represents a significant, we can call it national security threat. He did believe that. But I think there's the additional factor that he didn't want to have to bear the albatross if he didn't go all out for Biden of having carried Trump into power. Now, once Biden was elected, and that concern of Trump was set aside, he did have a choice. He could have tried to activate that same base and said, it's time for civil disobedience. It's time for mass demonstrations. It's time for occupying your Democratic and Republican Party offices, which was the civil rights movement and which was the New Deal. And he did not do that. Now, why he didn't do that, I think there's grounds for speculating on different things. My only point is he himself acknowledged that he couldn't get his platform through without those demonstrations. And then he abandoned that whole idea. He chose Biden's ear. So by his own reckoning, it had to end in failure, which it did.